So here's what we have. We're going to, after a short introduction, we just have this fantastic panel. So in a moment, we're going to turn to my colleague, Albert Laguna, who's an ethnicity, race, and migration and American studies at Yale. And he's going to talk to us about some core concepts in Latinx studies, some of the basics that we need. And then we're going to turn to my colleague, Ann Gebelein and Mejia-Giron, who are with the University of Connecticut. We're going to talk about some fantastic work they've done in developing Latinx studies curriculum for educators and students across the state. What's next, Jose?
Yeah, after that, we're going to hear from Krista Bianchini, who's an educator at Middletown High School, where she teaches a course on Latinx literature. And last, we're going to hear from a student at Metro High School here in New Haven. Their name is Bianca Osorio, and we're going to hear about her perspectives in a Latinx and African American history class.
Great, and then we have some time. Our colleague Natalia Brzezinski, a social studies teacher at Metro, is going to lead us through some Q&A via the chat, so we want to invite your questions. Jose, we cannot forget to thank our sponsors. So who do we have to thank tonight?
Of course. We are having this event thanks to the Anti-Racist Teaching Learning Collective, the Yale Education Studies, Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, the Public Humanities at Yale, and of course, our wonderful tech who gave the instructions for interpretation at the beginning, Carla Camacho, and the Q&A moderators, Natalia Brzezinski and Talia Zimak-Burset. And of course, Professor Hosing and myself are here throughout the event.
Great. Okay, welcome. Great to be with everyone. And thanks everyone for all the hard work you put in behind the scenes. Let's get going. Okay, wait. We cannot just get into our learning. We can't rush into it. You know, it's like you're going to go for a run or a workout. You start, you're going to hurt yourself. We need to warm our learning up, okay? So we have some questions for people to help them warm their learning up. But I'm going to expect you, Jose, to get these right because you compiled so many of these resources, okay, that I learned from you. So here we go. 3 questions, okay? Everyone get ready for the poll. Are we ready to launch the poll, Carla? All right, first question. Maria Colon Sanchez was known as La Madrina in what Connecticut city? A, Hartford, B, New Haven, C, Bridgeport, D, Waterbury. You can't just represent where you're from. We're looking for the correct answer here, right, Jose?
Yeah, correct answers only.
Correct. All right, Carla closed the poll, so you're cut off if you weren't too fast. All right, Jose, you better get, well, I don't know. You may get this right, you may not, but what answer are we looking for here?
I think it's Hartford.
Yes, the answer is Hartford. And this is really, really important. Good job there, Jose. Maria Colon Sanchez is a central figure in the history of Puerto Rican activism and politics in our state as well. The first Latina elected to the state legislature, a fierce advocate of educational equity, a reminder that the heroes just aren't out there. They're all around us in our community. Jose, you're 1 for 1. Are you ready for another question?
Let's do it.
Okay, and it looks like, yes, almost everyone got that one. So good job out there, people. We're good. We're getting warmed up here. Okay, question number 2. Okay, where can this statue of the Maroon leader, Sebastián Lemba, be found? The 16th century Maroon leader who led revolts of enslaved people. Where can it be found? A, in Puerto Rico, C, in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, B, C, Havana, Cuba, or D, in Brazil, Salvador de Bahia. Are you thinking on this one, Jose?
Yeah, I'm not too sure.
You don't know, do you?
No, I can guess though.
You're gonna have to, you might have to fake it, huh? All right, are we ready to close the poll? All right. What's your guess?
I'm gonna go with Santo Domingo.
I hope you're right, Jose, I really do. Yes, it's in Santo Domingo at the National Museum. And it, of course, reminds us of the long history of struggles against the slave trade and against slavery, the struggles of enslaved people, the Maroon presence all across the Caribbean, and the deep integration of all those issues. The 500-year resistance of that. Jose, you're 2 for 2. Are you ready for one more?
Let's do it.
All right, I'm really pulling for you here. And most people got that one right too. All right, here we go, everyone. Number 3, this one we get to listen to, okay, which is really exciting. We're going to listen to a recording, and then you're going to, this is a recording by the Los Angeles-based group Las Cafeteras, and it's a recording, a remix of what popular song? But let me play it for you first, okay? You ready, Jose?
Let's go.
Es la bamba rebelde, es la bamba rebelde que cantaré porque somos chicanos, porque somos chicanos de East LA, ay arriba y arriba, ay arriba y arriba y arriba iré, yo no creo en fronteras, yo no creo en fronteras, yo cruzaré, yo cruzaré, yo cruzaré.
All right, Jose, I can't give you any more, okay? This recording is a remix of what popular song? Is it Oye Como Va, La Bamba, Guantanamera, or Taki Taki?
I mean, I have to be honest, the song gave away the answer for me, so I'm going to go with B, La Bamba.
Oh my God, Jose, you are on fire. You are on fire. Let's see if you're right. Let's close this up. Yes, La Bamba. A song with deep, deep roots in the state of Veracruz, son jarocho. Wonderful song to teach with. This is Las Cafeteras, who's performed many times in Connecticut. They've stood with immigrant rights groups and campaigns here in our state. Their music and their videos are really rich, ways to think about cultural production and imagination. And of course, it's a recording of Richie Valens. So Jose, you did it, okay? You got us warmed up. That was great. And there was a request, a reminder to define maroon, which were enslaved people who escaped all across the history of slavery and led rebellions against their enslavers, sometimes violent rebellions, and also set up free autonomous communities. And there's histories of these all across the Western Hemisphere. So really important part of Latinx studies, as we'll learn tonight. Okay, Jose, let's, all right, we got to get to our panelists in a second, but we're about to drop something you and your colleagues have been working on for a while now. Can you tell us about this Teaching Latinx Studies resource guide?
Yeah, this resource guide is just a start to compiling different resources about teaching Latinx studies across the classroom. So it features resources that range from films to full multi-week curriculum units. And these can be in use in elementary classrooms, middle school classrooms, and also in high school classrooms. And our point in trying to compile all of this is to give you a starting point into the expansive and very collaborative nature of what Latinx studies means. And we hope you can use these resources in collaboration with your students and to kind of invite new forms of inquiry. And if you have any suggestions for what to add, our emails are in this document that you'll see in the chat. So feel free to message us and we can add in every resource. We want to take in everyone's input at this event because we know you all have a lot of expertise to offer as well.
Thank you so much, Jose, for reminding us that this expertise is everywhere. It's in community-based organizations, it's in families, it's in oral histories, it's at all the community colleges, the state universities, everywhere. And we're going to collectively teach and learn from one another. So thank you for all this amazing work. And this is a work in progress. I'm just going to plug two quick upcoming events that I also want to put on people's radar. The first is on Wednesday, March 24th, we're having a webinar titled about teaching Black and Latinx studies in Connecticut. So a wonderful educator, Dr. Kelly Hope, well before the state will roll out a curriculum, has written an extensive curriculum about teaching Black and Latinx studies. She's done it with a community-based organization in Waterbury, the Ungroup Society. So Dr. Hope, representatives from the Ungroup Society and students will talk about that class. They've already taught the class. It's centered on social movements, on students, on anti-racist learning, and we're going to get to hear from them. So especially people who plan to teach this class will want to tune in, and we'll be sharing a copy of that curriculum. And then a wonderful event on March 30th about an introduction to teaching Indigenous studies with three leading Native studies educators in our state, Sandy Grande from UConn, Ndawa Spears, a community-based educator, and Beth Regan, along with two students. So don't miss that. And absolutely, make sure you sign up for our mailing list if you're not on it. Okay, that's the plug. I'm going to stop our share because I'll get to this. Can we, I want to just welcome our first panelist now. Professor Albert Laguna from Yale. Albert, thank you so much for being with us.
A pleasure, a pleasure. I just been told I've been spotlighted, so I feel very.
Yeah, not anybody can be spotlighted, as you know, so you should feel special. Okay, so Albert, you know, what we were hoping to get from you here, there's a lot of terms that we can often hear connected to the Latinx studies. There's Latin American studies, Chicano studies, Puerto Rican studies, Latino studies, Latina studies, Latinx studies. So I'm first, you've taught this for many, many years. It infuses all of your class. Can you just give us a sense, like what are these terms and what's the vocabulary here?
Yeah, so I'll give a little bit of historical background. I'm gonna drop some resources in the chat that can hopefully build out the guide and you know, inform our Q&A later. But first, Latin American studies, right? Latin American studies in the US was born out of an area studies logic. What does that mean? It means that the US government helped to fund Latin American studies at universities, independent councils, and think tanks with the idea that these investments would inform US foreign policy in Latin America. This investment in Latin American studies absolutely explodes with the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which brought the Soviet Union explicitly into the Western Hemisphere, right? Money starts pouring into Latin American studies as part of a Cold War logic that many of you probably know, which was to guard against the communist menace by all means possible, right? That's not to say that the field of Latin American studies has always been aligned with US political interests, not at all. But often those interests have not been for the good of Latin Americans themselves, right? But Latin American studies, its genesis serves as a powerful contrast to Puerto Rican, Chicano, and Latinx studies, right? If Latin American studies was conceived primarily as a top-down project, right? United States looking towards Latin America, these other fields have been bottom-up, born out of protest movements, right? So Puerto Rican studies is born out of activism in the late 1960s and 70s in Chicago and specifically New York City by Puerto Ricans. Tired and fed up with the government neglect and institutional racism against their community, young Puerto Ricans took to the street to address racial and class inequality and to question the US relationship with Puerto Rico, which is to this day a colony of the United States. This is best represented in the Young Lords Party, a group of young Puerto Rican radicals who helped to organize the community more broadly. And one of the outcomes of this political organizing was the institution of Puerto Rican studies formerly within the City University of New York system, CUNY. And I just want to throw a link in the chat to this fantastic book about the history of the Young Lords Party called The Young Lords, A Radical History. Great book if you want to learn more about that. Similar thing happens in the Southwestern United States in the 60s and 70s when people of Mexican descent begin to organize to demand their rights. It happens in the context of labor with folks like Cesar Chavez, and it happens in urban areas where young Mexican Americans calling themselves Chicanos and Chicanas begin to organize. This also translates into representation in the academy with Chicano studies departments popping up at public universities in the Southwest. And a great resource to learn about this is a book called Chicano, ! The History of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. And there's a fantastic documentary that came out of this book that is all over YouTube. It's really, really teachable. I highly recommend you take a look at that, right? Latino studies begins to pop up in the 80s and 90s, again, because of student demands to include scholars thinking across Latinx communities, not just Puerto Rican or Chicano, but other groups like Dominicans, Cubans, Central Americans, etc., and also to encourage work across groups comparatively, right? I think the main takeaway from this quick gloss is that Latino, Latinx studies, and ethnic studies more broadly is a product of youth organizing and making demands that they be represented within institutions of higher learning that have historically left them out, right? You show me a new department of ethnic studies or an initiative to hire more faculty of color at a university, and I'll show you the student activism that made it possible. It's very rare that a dean wakes up in the middle of the night and says, we need to hire more faculty of color and establish ethnic studies. It doesn't happen. It comes from demands from the student body, right? Just to quickly sum up, other concepts, important things to know about Latinx studies. I want to just point you to a really great teachable resource as well. Keywords in Latino studies from NYU Press. Again, it takes a keywords approach. So words like borderlands, transnational, white, queer, these terms are defined in a Latinx studies context in a way that's really helpful and short and readable.
So helpful there, Albert. I'm going to turn to Jose in a second so you can ask, another question, but I'm just struck. One, you're reminding us Latin American studies, not the same thing. It actually comes from a distinct history. Doesn't mean we don't study what's today Latin America. In Latino studies, it can be diasporic, but we can't just conflate them. Sometimes we hear that, Latino studies, Latin American studies, you know what I mean? You're saying that's not it. And the political, the social movements behind this, you're saying are core to this, right? The students themselves, centered on students, driven by students. Okay, Jose, I know you have a question for Professor Laguna as well, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think in talking about how we define Latinx studies, we can't come to that definition without addressing the very rampant anti-Blackness that's present in the Latina community. So my question to you is just, considering how overlooked the Black presence can be in Latinx studies, can you give us a sense of why it's important to address the African diasporic presence in these histories?
Absolutely. It's hard, right? Because it's such a big topic, right? So it's, but I'll do my best, right? First, I want to say, luckily, there's been an explosion of work in the field of Afro-Latinx studies in the last 15 years, I'd say, right? A really important foundational text is a book edited by Miriam Perez Roman and Juan Flores called The Afro-Latino Reader. I'll put that in the chat as well. And I think I'll start answering this question with a bit of context that I think always comes as a bit of a shock to people. According to work of scholars working on the Black presence in the Americas, broadly speaking, of the approximately 11.2 million slaves that survived the Middle Passage, only about 450,000 landed in the United States. The rest landed in the Caribbean and South America. The island of Cuba, which is roughly the size of Pennsylvania, received almost double the number of slaves that the US did, right? So it's just a vast history and presence here, right? If you're interested in this and are looking for a good, perhaps a bit flawed introduction to the topic that is also highly teachable, I encourage you to look at Henry Louis Gates's 4-part documentary called Black in Latin America. It's I think a really great teaching resource. All of this is to say there's a substantial Black presence in Latin America and certainly within Latinx communities in the US. Understanding and teaching this presence is important for understanding the broader movements of the global African diaspora, but it also gives us an opportunity to put a little meat on the bones of this. I feel like when you get to college, you're given a folder that says race is a social construct, right? But when you study race in another context, it helps you understand that, oh yes, it is a social construct because race works differently in Latin America. People have different relationships to racial identity. It's often, especially in the Caribbean context, more on a continuum than the Black and white binary that's dominant in the US. So that's one way that understanding Blackness in Latin America and Latinx communities helps to complicate how we understand race. It helps us understand how anti-Blackness, yes, exists within Latinx communities and the politics of that in the US context, right? It's an opportunity to understand points of tension of Latinx communities not maybe wanting to build relationships with African-American communities, but also just the opposite. And I really have to, put a point on this because I think it's often, we talk about kind of anti-Blackness, but also community building that happens, right? Examples of Black Latinx people who actively built community and solidarity with African-Americans, especially my favorite example is 19th century New York City, where Black Cubans and some white Cubans and Puerto Ricans migrated to New York City to work and organize against Spanish colonial rule. I'm sorry, it was white and Black Cubans who migrated to the US, but white Cubans were also trying to build community and political organizing with Black Cubans and Puerto Ricans in New York City. Anyway, these migrants from Puerto Rico and Cuba built extensive political social networks with African Americans. That's chronicled beautifully in a book called Racial Migrations, New York City and the Revolutionary Politics of the Spanish Caribbean. Also going to put it in a chat, beautifully written. And I always like to connect the past to the present. So some of you may have heard of a very important library called the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is part of the New York City Public Library System. It is hands down one of the most important archives in the world for the study of the global African diaspora. The center is named after Arturo Schomburg, a Black Puerto Rican migrant who settled in New York City in the 19th century and was very active in bridging Black communities from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and African Americans in New York City, right? He donated his entire collection. He was a bibliophile. He collected a ton of materials about the global Black diaspora to the New York Public Library, and they started this library under his name.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I appreciate how you're really just challenging us to think about what constitutes the study of Latin America and its diaspora, and thinking about how you can't undertake that study without looking at the African diasporic presence within the discipline. So I really appreciate that. And I'll turn over to Professor Hosang to lead us into an example of another curriculum unit.
Yeah, and I just want to say also, I think why that's very important for us, what Professor Laguna is sharing, is that the state curriculum that at the high school level that offers an elective in Black and Latinx studies has split these two up. So there's a semester of Black studies and a semester of Latinx studies. There's obviously other ways to teach that, but we want to remind educators that there's many, many connections that lie at the heart of both of these studies that need to be brought together, as Professor Laguna reminded us. Before we turn to our next set, so we're going to welcome Anna and Maria in a second. Jose and I want to spotlight some of just these great resources that are in the guide. So I'm just going to share one of these very quickly while we make this transition. And there are different grade levels. So sorry about this. We're going to go through these quickly. There we go. So this is a wonderful for elementary school teachers, elementary literacy teachers, a wonderful, wonderful book titled When We Love Someone, We Sing to Them, by the author Ernesto Martinez. It tells the story, and I'll show you these beautiful illustrations of a young boy whose father is a singer, sings in the tradition of serenatas, and asks for a song that he can sing to another young boy to express his love. And so it's beautifully, beautifully illustrated by Maya Gonzalez, relates histories of intimacy, of traditions of serenatas, of indigenous symbolisms about love and intimacy and kinship that are really, really powerful about music as well. It's an award-winning book, highly, highly recommended. And it's also connected to a film, I think, that Jose is going to tell us about briefly.
Yeah, so there's a film adaptation, and it gives you more of a picture into how the parents are contending with their son coming into his own queerness and expression of love for another boy. The film is available on HBO, and it's about 15 to 20 minutes, so very short and great to include as a viewing and part of your classrooms. Yeah, we hope you enjoy watching it.
Great, great. And won lots of awards, and really, really highly recommended by educators. Okay, let's bring Anne, our dear colleagues, Anne and Maria from UConn. And I think, Jose, you have the first questions for them.
Yeah. Is Anne here yet?
Yeah, Anne is being spotlighted, and so
there we go.
Awesome. Go ahead, Jose.
Yeah, so we'll just get started. So last year, when the state had developed its committees to create the course for Black and Latinx studies, both of you sprang into action in creating your own course where you talked about writing for the community. And a question we have for you is just, how did you decide what needs to survey from the Latina community across the state when creating this course? And for Maria specifically, I know that you went back to your own high school to interview teachers and students to kind of source these answers and developing that curriculum. So can you talk more about what you learned in those conversations and what insights you can offer to other teachers who are looking to start a course and start teaching within Latinx studies?
Of course. Hello, everyone. Good evening. So right off the bat, the thing that surprised me the most when I got to Wilby, because I had just been in their shoes, and every time we had someone come in and talk to us, a lot of the time the students were uninterested or didn't want to participate. So I can't lie, I was a little nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, I hope I can make them comfortable enough to answer the questions that I brought that day. And oh my gosh, I was so blown away by the answers I got. Honestly, the students, all I had to do was ask the question and the students bounced off each other. It was an ongoing conversation. At one point, one of the teachers had to remind them, like, the bell rang, we have to go. And I learned a lot, but for the sake of time, I chose three themes, that I got from the answers from the students. One of them was when I asked them what did they want to see in this course, what did they want to learn about, one of the things that they said was more positive contributions from Black and Latinx in our society. A lot of the times when we learn about these Black figures, these Latinx figures, or even just our history in general, it's always more of like slavery, you know, a lot of the things that are tough to talk about. And of course, those are completely important to touch on, but they also want to know, well, what are some happy instances of our history? You know, what are some positive contributions that I want to learn about my history? Another theme that came up a lot was stereotypes. And they're very well aware that they're stereotyped in public, you know, it's an everyday thing for them. So they were telling me like, why? Where do those stereotypes come from? What defines good hair, bad hair, you know? Why do I feel like I'm being watched when I walk into a grocery store? You know, these are very real things that these high school students are going through. And another thing that came up a lot too, especially being in an urban area, was I see other people that look at me in my community, look like me in my communities. And I also see that these communities are labeled as bad, or like, don't go to that part of town, you know, or they were telling me how that's where they see cigarettes being promoted the most, or that's where they see liquor being sold, you know, that's where they see drugs being sold. And they're like, how did this happen? How did the Black communities decide, hey, let's move to this part of town? And why were they automatically stereotyped as bad parts of town? And so going on to the second part of that question, what can this show to the new teachers in Latinx? To me personally, I just felt like these students are well aware of the discrimination they're facing, you know? It's not something new to them because like I said earlier, it's their daily life. So they're very aware of what is happening, they go through it. And for them, it was more so they want to understand why they go through it.
I'm just going to jump in with a follow-up because that's so, Mani, you just opened up so much there about that. It's not just about like studying a group or studying, you know, a group's history. You're talking about how people inhabit and live and face those things with like a much deeper sense of what this work does. I know, Maria, since you've, you know, been at UConn, you've had a chance, you're majoring in this. Could you talk about maybe a little bit about how, what that's meant for you to take classes in these areas? Maybe it's, shaped and developed your own thinking?
Absolutely. And I actually didn't declare Latinx Studies as my second major until my second semester of freshman year. And it was because I took an intro class to Latinx history, and Anne actually came in and, you know, talked about the major. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that was an option. Like I was completely blindsided. And it just has meant so much to me, especially now that I know it's a privilege to even learn about myself. So many students don't get the opportunity, don't have the major offered in their colleges. And I was talking to Anna the other day, it's just a sense of empowerment, like knowing that there are people out there like you in history who have accomplished these great things and being like, well, that could be me next, you know, because you never know so many things and then you learn, and it's so empowering.
Yeah, just describing it as like a kind of feeling. Also, it's not, it's more than it's the knowledge, but it's something else, right? It goes beyond that. So, Anne, could we turn to you next? And I think you were gonna. I just also want to say, so Anne is the co-director of El Instituto, you know, a long-standing, a really important institution, and just these were colleagues that as soon as we understood there was a need to support teachers. Shifted the entire class towards students producing curriculum and content in this area, ready for action, ready to provide this. You all went through a lot, Maria. I know you all in your classmates did a lot of work. And could you just give us a taste maybe of some of the resources and questions and themes that you came up with together?
Sure, although Maria's a hard act to follow.
Yes.
But I had a class of 17 Latinx students from all over Connecticut, really, and we saw this CIRC initiative as really important, not just for state high school students, but also for universities to really think about our own trajectories in Latino studies, and it's also an important time to really check in and make sure that we're giving Latino students what they need. And so Maria took the initiative to start interviewing high school students. And of course, we were interviewing ourselves and our other Latinx students on campus to really think about what we need to be offering in Latino studies. And it was really powerful to see high school student testimony align with college student testimony. And, you know, college students were sort of crowdsourcing their knowledge about Latino studies courses they had taken at UConn. And we were trying to think about how do we boil down what we've all learned across courses, and how can we think about what is the most important or the most significant classes, books, movies that we've taken in Latino studies. But Latino students were weighing in the same way in which Waterbury students were, right? They want to be able to communicate effectively about race and bias. They want to be able to respond when people say insensitive things. They want to express pride, dignity in their cultures. They want to feel empowered. They want to empower others. Knowledge is power. We all know that. We're most educators. So they thought it'd be really important that any course and any course program or any Latino studies program be able to explain how Latinos have contributed to and shaped Connecticut and the nation. So I'm just gonna screen share with you for just a second. Hopefully this will work. Wait, this. So the next step that we took as a class was we dug into the social studies frameworks for Connecticut. And for any of those, if you looked at that book, it's 150 big pages, but we focused on the 18 pages that are dedicated to US history. And my students pulled out of those 18 pages the themes from the social studies frameworks that they thought resonated with them, that would also help teachers find ways in to Latino studies who weren't experts in it. So students came up with or tweaked questions that are in this guide in a way that would help us think about in any Latino studies program or in any course, what are things that align with the frameworks, but that also are important to Latino students. So you can read them here. And then with 5, I want to place an emphasis in what was really important to the committee I was on. It, I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in the SHRC process. So, number 5 was really important to us in thinking about how freedom, equality, and social justice is really also an exploration of race. So students made that more explicit than in the Connecticut Studies frameworks, but it aligns with SHRC's objectives as they are designed now, and what the Anti-Racist Collective also cares about. So just to highlight that.
Great. Thanks. So there's lots of resources that you're gonna make available soon. We're gonna move on in a second to Krista, our teacher from Middletown, but can you just say quickly about how people can access these resources moving forward?
Yeah, there really are a lot of resources at UConn. Anybody can email me. I'm happy to. We have a really important Puerto Rican citizenship archives project that has actually won some national awards by Professor Venator, who's an expert in Puerto Rican politics. We have Ruth Glasser's classic guide on Puerto Rican migration to Connecticut, Aquí Me Quedo, uploaded on laplazavirtual.org. The Puerto Rican Heritage Trail is also on there, another project out of Trinity College. And La Plaza Virtual won't really be ready for teachers until September, but you can check back to La Plaza Virtual and sooner or later. It will have a lot of information on Latino studies.
Great, okay. So thanks so much to you both. Really rich resources. Before we bring on Krista, Maria, could I just turn back to you just for one last question here? Lots of educators with us tonight. Just any advice you have, some people new to teaching about Latinx studies, you've taken some courses, just any last sense of advice you have to get people going on that kind of journey?
Yeah, I would just say, like, first of all, be prepared to, but most importantly, not scared to learn alongside the students, because a lot of this stuff is new material for everyone, for both parties, you know? And I don't think it's fair to expect anyone to know everything right away, especially as it's just being implemented. So yeah, I would say don't be scared to learn with the students. And when it gets tough, just remember how much it means to them and how many new doors it's going to open for them.
That's just so perfectly put. Thank you so much for that. I just appreciate how encouraging that is, inviting people, right, into the importance. Thank you so much. I think are we ready for Krista, to bring Krista in? So thanks so much, Anna, and we'll come back to Anna Maria in the question and answer. Okay, so I think I'm gonna start off with a couple of questions for Krista and then turn to you, Jose. Is that okay? So Krista, you're a literature teacher at Middletown High School. And you, a couple of years ago, I think, decided to start this course in Latinx literature. So hoping you could just start off by telling us just a little bit about like what needs you thought really could be filled by a course like this, and how it sought to respond to student interest.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been an educator for about 9 years, having taught in Waterbury and now teaching in Middletown. And, I think specifically at Middletown, we've done a lot of work in regards to being reflective about our curriculum, making sure our curriculum is diverse, is inclusive, but there was still a lot of room to grow. And, even in looking at the high school curriculum from 9 to 12, and looking at the authors that we presented and the stories that we presented, we really only had, one Latinx story, which was House on Mango Street. It's something that I teach with my 10th graders. And I adore that story, absolutely. But my fear was that it might become, for many of our students, the single story of an entire community of people. And, what's the danger, therefore, in only hearing one story of a group and a people and a person. And so myself, in conjunction with my ELA supervisor, Dan Rauchi, kind of talked a little bit about, would this be an opportunity to create a class like Latinx Literature, in which we could provide students an opportunity and an avenue to check out the wide dearth of books and stories from an entire community of people that they really have had no knowledge in. And so the idea kind of came out of that, went to the Board of Ed, went to the superintendent, got approval, and then just kind of worked within the school and within the junior students to kind of sell the program. So I actually have some information that I'll share.
Great, yeah, so I think we're gonna take a look at some of the work from this class.
Yep, I have some work. I could drop it actually in the chat. I have some artifacts that I pulled. So I will just share right now in the chat the link to it for those of you that want to check it out. Actually, I'll pull it up at the end, but let me just pull this up. Give me a moment. There we go. So I went to all the junior advisories just to talk a little bit about what the class was, because we've never had a class like this before in Middletown. They've never seen this before. And I just went to each student and I kind of broke down, what are we learning in the class? What's the game plan? What are we going to talk about? And I was very intentional with making sure that the students felt like this is a class for everybody. And, it's not just a class for a certain subsect of student. And we talked a little bit about how we're going to not just look at literature and look at stories, but the context, because, at the end of the day, when we look at, Latinx literature, it's not just the literature, it's the history, it's the culture, it's what has happened over hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I wanted to let students know that this is almost going to be more of a humanities class than it is a literature class, because they're going to get all that information that they never necessarily had when they were taking other history classes. So we were going to talk about national ancestry, colorism, gender discrimination, and various themes, trends, and all of those kind of sorts of things within our literature. I also let our students know that, I'm not an expert in this field. I'm learning right with them. Who am I to say, like, these are the 3 or 4 best Latinx literature books, and here they are, call it a day. I have designed this curriculum and this class with the intention of students having choice in what they want to read, choice in the stories that they want to hear about, and for them to know that there's a lot of choice. There are a lot of stories, there are a lot of books. And so all the books that you see on the screen right now are books that we have in our class. Currently, I have about 35 to 40 books. This is, of course, a small sampling, and all of my students have the ability to read them at any time. And I've been using a lot of them, especially Open Veins of Latin America, to supplement our lessons. I also let them know that I'm looking at literature in the, when I say literature, it's not just a book. It is really, truly the story of a people. And so we're looking at movies, we're looking at TV shows, we're looking at music, we're looking at a lot of different ways in which the Latinx community has been perceived, depicted, and commented on. And then I kind of wrapped it up again with the question of, how do I know this is for me, right? How do I know I could take this class? What will I get out of this class? So I went to the junior advisory classes, and I am very fortunate this year to have 2 full sections of Latinx literature students. They are doing a phenomenal job. And this is just a very rough, simplistic overview of what we've learned so far. So we start the year with our first unit. I call it the beginning because, for me and for my students, Latinx literature didn't start when Columbus showed up. It's been there for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. So we start with the creation myths coming out of the Mayas, Aztecs, Muiscas, Incas. We look at the culture, we look at the history, and we really start diving deep into what students want to learn within those civilizations and cultures. We then move to colonization and the effects of colonization. How does the stories that we're starting to collect shift? What are the perceptions of the indigenous peoples? And are we getting the full story here? Unit 3 focuses on revolutions and revolutionaries, and that's actually where we are now. And Unit 3 is kind of like where the floodgate opens in terms of book choice. So for this unit, my students have about 13 or 14 books that they can choose from that all focus on different revolutions or different moments in history, either through a fictional or non-fictional lens. After that, we move to migration, and we look at that concept of double consciousness, the struggle and the power within the Latinx community, and then we end our year with perspectives in multimedia. So I was very cognizant to make sure it's both, chronological, so we could track the evolution, but also providing a lot of student opportunities to investigate on their own. So this is just a very quick snapshot. And again, at the end, I'll put the link to my folder where I have some artifacts, but the student reception has been really powerful. They're loving it. And it's nice to get the reception and the feedback from them. So we do a lot of digital work, of course, because we're hybrid. But I'm very consistent with asking my students, what did you think? What did you take in? How does this connect with what we've been learning? Where do you want to go from here? And they've been giving quality feedback on that.
So great. Lots of appreciation, Krista, in the chat. And I just, it's like saying something is student-centered is often just like a kind of mantra or saying in, education. But I just so appreciate the way you're showing us in very clear ways how you put students at the center. I'll say I want to turn over to you for the last question to Krista.
Yeah, I think if you just look at the chart really quick of how in awe everyone is of this curriculum, and it's so amazing, and I'm sure it took you a lot of time. Just putting those colors together, the creation was really a lot.
It's my job.
Exactly.
It's what I do every day. Thank you for that.
Of course, no, and you definitely deserve the thanks and more that you're receiving in the chat. And kind of related to that, we wanted to know what advice you can share to teachers who might not have deep training in the materials, who are maybe new to the content. What would you say to them?
Yeah, honestly, I still very much feel like this is a work in progress, but a few of my takeaways are, first off, if you're going to teach this class or a version of this class, you really need to do some deep reflection. What do you know? What do you think you know? And that was big for me too, in engaging in the research process with all this information. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I grew up in a very homogeneous community. I went to a homogeneous, public school system. So there was a lot that I thought I knew that I didn't really know at all. So do some reflection, do some digging, figure out what you don't know, and really rely on your colleagues, rely on people around you and your community for where you teach in terms of resources. So that is one big takeaway. And the second big takeaway is be consistent in engaging your students with feedback. They have been so helpful, even in just discussing, did this lesson go over well? What did you take out of this? What do you want to learn more? They are so hungry to be a part of their educational process. And it gives so much ownership to them. And it's so much more meaningful for the students to say, hey, this is where I think we should go. This is where I think we should explore. I have questions on this. And then to, help them guide, so to speak, the boat. So those are my biggest takeaways and advice.
That's amazing. And just hearing you share how much you put students first really makes me wish you were my teacher. K through 12. So
that is that of me, right, Jose?
Literally.
Thank you so much. And I am happy to share everything that I've worked on and my information to anyone else who'd be curious. So just reach out in the chat.
Wonderful. Amazing. Thank you, Krista. We'll look forward to welcoming you back. We're going to bring Bianca on now from Metro High School. Jose and I have two more quick curriculum resources that we're just going to mention to you really quickly. The first, I guess, I'll talk about, Jose, especially for middle school teachers across subjects, social studies, literature, even science, in the curriculum resource guide that's been put together, lots and lots of Spanish language classes, other language classes, lots and lots of resources on centering Afro-Latinos in these curricular units. So multimedia, literature, stories, on and on. So this is to Professor Laguna's point about the proliferation of resources and lots of primary sources that we want to encourage teachers to look at and to see about incorporating into their classes right now. Jose, do you want to talk about this great one as well for high school?
Yeah, so this is more geared for high school students. It has a plethora of primary resources, news articles, and it explores the condition for freedom in the island of Puerto Rico, talks about greater Caribbean trends and imagining Latinx studies. And it's a really great resource if you're looking to a history of the present. How are things unveiling in the island and how is that related to US interests and colonialism, its continued ties to Puerto Rico, and how students can really understand their own position in relation to this history that they're learning. And yeah, so this syllabus has a lot of resources. It does it chronologically, and it's also included in the resource guide for anyone who's interested.
All right. Okay. Thanks for sharing that, and produced by leading scholars in the field of Puerto Rican studies, but organized the syllabus. So thanks, Jose. Okay, we have last but absolutely not least, Bianca from Metro High School. And Jose, I'm going to turn it over to you to get our conversation going with Bianca.
Yeah, so Bianca, I'm first just really excited to talk with you. You were one of the first students at Metro to take a class that brings together Latinx and African American studies, taught by Ms. Natalia Berginski. So I wanted to get your just kind of opinions on that class. Can you share kind of what worked and a few highlights and activities that you did for other educators who might want to learn how to lead that classroom?
Yeah, of course. So I have always been more of an interactive learner. I learn best when I'm put in an activity where I have to role play as someone in history or something like that. And Miss Natalia is really great at having those kinds of activities. Just the other day, I was role playing as Arturo Schomburg, which I thought was funny because he was mentioned earlier. And I was just kind of talking about his accomplishments and kind of why he began collecting pieces of history. And I thought that was really interesting, the fact that his teacher had told him that people of African descent didn't have any history or achievements. And I thought that it was just very interesting that he was Afro-Puerto Rican, and someone was like, yeah, you don't have any history or anything. And so I really appreciate Miss Natalia and her like ability to have those kinds of lessons where she just kind of gives us a source and we pick out like the most interesting things, and then we act as if we're that person and why, you know, what we're doing is important. She does a lot of also like kind of last couple of classes, we've been doing a trial about Puerto Rican, like if Puerto Rico should become a state or if it should become like independent. And that was also really, really interesting for me. Just hearing like the different sides of everybody. I was pro independence. I think that just based on the history, I think that Puerto Rico should go independent. And I appreciate Ms. Italia for giving me more resources to kind of learn about that, because my family is from Puerto Rico and I don't really hear that much about it, even though like they were from there. So yeah.
Yeah, and I just appreciate so much how you're bringing in your interest in this study, being so rooted in your own family, your own community. And I wanted to know, just related to that, if you could talk more about what you learned in conversations with your own family, right? Because you shared with us that you've talked to people in your family about the classes that they've taken in Puerto Rican and Latinx studies. So can you share like what you've learned from your own family and how you see your own kind of position informing your interest in learning about this history?
Yeah, so both my grandparents and my dad were born in Puerto Rico, and they were in Puerto Rican schools until they were about in like middle school, almost in, like high school. And when I asked them, they actually told me that they didn't really learn too much about Puerto Rican history, what happened before Columbus. They did learn that Puerto Ricans are a big mixing pot of like Indians, African Americans, Europeans, stuff like they learned the basics, but they never really went into depth about the history. And then when they went to American schools, they just didn't really hear about Puerto Rican school, like Puerto Rican history at all. So I feel like compared to me, that's so completely different. I'm here, I'm able to take a class where I learn not only about Puerto Rican history, but about African history, about Mexican history, all about that stuff. And I feel like that's just making me a more knowledgeable person. And I feel like they really missed out on that in schooling. Because I mean, if they went to American schools and like they weren't taught about Puerto Rico, which is a part of the United States, imagine how lost kind of like Mexican history, Cuban history, stuff like that, like gets in American schools, you know, it just, they don't learn about that stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I just need to continue kind of spreading what I learned from Miss Natalia to them. And that's what I've been doing. I've been sharing like the assignments that I do with them. I'm like, well, this is really cool. Like this person did this.
It's amazing. That, you know, you're both, as we talked about, a student and an educator at the same time, even in your own circles. Are there, you know, just as we wrap up, Bianca, are there other examples that you want to share from the class that might be helpful to just illustrate so people get a sense of what happens? This is also a class, if I understand right, that puts Black and Latinx studies together. So you're learning them alongside, and maybe you could talk to us about the insights you get from thinking about those together.
Yeah, definitely. So Miss Natalia actually did an assignment on the Mexican-American War, and she did a really good job of connecting kind of like the Mexican history, like why they were so important to African history, because Mexican people were against slavery. They didn't want slavery in Mexico. And when America took over, you know, it was going to just expand more slavery. And I never knew that. I thought that that was awesome. So just learning about that stuff, she does amazing podcasts. Like she shares podcasts with us that I think I learned the best from. She shares like bits and pieces, and she'll give us a link, and that's where I go ahead and watch the podcasts again, just to kind of reiterate and kind of take notes by myself, because I think you don't learn enough in your lifetime.
I love that about just grabbing like small things, and it's just a reminder of small things that like educators can do to integrate audio and other kinds. And there's a request, and maybe Natalia, you can mention some of those podcasts. Bianca, last question that we've asked everyone, just other advice, lots of educators, you know, all of us trying to think about how we might get into you know, teaching more about it, advice you would have for them who are kind of new to this area.
For me, I think that I think it's awesome when teachers kind of ask you about your history and kind of what you know about your own history, because, you know, from what I know from my grandparents, maybe Miss Natalia doesn't know, and I like to share that stuff with her. And I also think just not being afraid to admit like you don't know something, and just researching it again afterwards, so that then you can be like, hey, I learned this, so I want to share it with you guys. Thank you for, you know, like bringing that idea up to me. So yeah.
Okay, Jose, any other questions? Should we ready to thank Bianca?
Yeah, no, I'm just so grateful to be in conversation with you, Bianca. And again, like literally y'all are taking the best classes, and like where were these classes when I went to high school? But it's okay, I won't be too salty. Thank you so much again. And yeah, I'm also really grateful for Natalia, who's not spotlighted right now, but just for doing all this amazing work in your classroom. We're really appreciative of that too.
Great, thank you so much, Bianca, and we'll welcome you back. Okay, I think Natalia, now it is time to spotlight you and to bring you on and to help facilitate some Q&A. Some questions are starting to pop up in the chat. We have a few minutes left tonight. So welcome, Natalia, social studies teacher at Metro High School, member of the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective Steering Committee. Welcome, Natalia.
Thank you, hello. So we've got a few questions going so far, but keep them coming. A question that a few folks have asked about are, how can teachers who don't have the opportunity or flexibility to teach full Latinx history courses still incorporate Latinx history in their courses? So I think many people could speak to this. Whoever wants to jump in first, please go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Albert. Thank you. Go.
I mean, one way is to connect like those kind of prime moments in a social studies textbook to a broader Latin American context, right? So if you're going to teach the Spanish-American War, which very conveniently leaves out the Cuban part of it, Spanish-American-Cuban War, you can bring in the Cuban history. You can talk about how Cubans and Puerto Ricans were in exile in New York because they were persecuted by the Spanish, right? You can talk about, when you're talking about westward expansion, right? You can talk about the Texas, the U.S. war against Mexico, U.S.-Mexico war, right? And the movement of the border, right? How that changed the kind of face of the United States quite literally. So there are ways, I think, and talk about popular culture around that. For example, corridos, music, right? That kind of was born out of these border ballads, right? Around this, these histories and the experience of living on the borders. So there are ways to kind of build out, right? Because, you know, what I always say is you cannot tell US history without Latin America and vice versa, right? So there are ways to kind of build out and spotlight that Latinx presence strategically through these big prime moments that get so much attention in the social studies textbook.
Anyone else want to speak to that question?
I'm wondering if, oh, go ahead, Anne, thanks.
Oh, I was going to say there are just so many lessons that if you go back to that list of just what are the things you're teaching already, right? You're already teaching about labor. So throw in a lesson or two about, you know, the Watsonville canner strike or the Farrah garment strike in Texas. You know, these are strikes led by Latino women that were really significant in their states. You know, if you're talking about something even like Brown versus Board of Ed, you know, Latino studies started the desegregation court struggle, right? Lemon Grove incident, 1931 in San Diego County, Mendez versus Westminster, 1946, California. So there's also ways to really link together things you're already doing. Social justice is another easy topic you already know a lot about that you can just sort of add on to. Add Young Lords onto Black Panthers, add the Chicano walkouts to other protests you're looking at in the 60s. There's lots of little things you can do.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that point about labor, I think a lot of teachers in Connecticut and maybe across the country teach about labor history, but they tend to like whitewash that labor history and focus primarily only on white men when labor history extends, certainly into Latinx studies and Black studies and feminist and queer studies. So yeah, looking at those intersections that I saw in Krista's course, that's great. So a bit more here. There's a question for Professor Laguna. You talked about how anti-racist education reform has been largely driven by student activism, and it's definitely still ongoing. So I'll just interject for a moment to say, shout out to the students in Connecticut who got this mandate passed in the state legislature for African American and Latinx studies in Connecticut. What advice do you have for student activists today who are pushing for anti-racist pedagogies in their own schools and districts? And I think, Professor Laguna, you can certainly weigh in, but I think the young people also can jump in too.
Yeah, so historically, it's about creating a critical mass and being seen, right? And making demands to the institution with a logic, like, why do you want this, right? And, I gotta be honest, you gotta make some noise. Right? Because I'll give you an example at Yale. What Yale doesn't want is bad press or to have to talk to their alums about, and this is being recorded. It's all right, I have tenure now. They don't want to have to go to their alums and be like, there's problems at Yale. They want everything to be great, right? And the same thing, no one wants to have bad press or look bad, right? So being present, being visible, and making demands, right? And having, what's also very helpful is having a sense of what's been done before, having other examples. This is being done in another school district, comparables, right? Say this can be done here. All these things, like the practical with like what we want, but also the very obvious, the very important, it cannot be ignored presence of demanding, right? Critical mass is absolutely crucial. You have to be seen and you have to be heard, right? I can say so much more about this, but I'll leave it there and let the pros who've actually done it on their campuses say something.
Other folks want to jump in here? I know that, shout out for sure. Let's get specific to Students for Educational Justice, Hearing Youth Voices, Connecticut Students for a Dream. These are some of the youth groups, Citywide Youth Coalition, who led the charge in Connecticut. Do other folks, Maria and Bianca, do you want to share anything about how like youth activism can make some moves? Or what role you see young people having in just pushing for racial justice, whether it's in school or beyond?
During our class, we had the opportunity to have Hearing Youth Voices actually come in and do a presentation for us. And they had it was so professional. They had a PowerPoint, and they showed us an excerpt of I don't want to say it was a play, but it was definitely something they did on stage in front of parents and a whole bunch of important people. And everyone in that room was just like quiet, just taking everything in, absorbing everything in. And it's just so like, you look at the kids and I was like, oh my gosh, when I was your age, like I wasn't doing this. And it just makes me so happy to see, even before college, kids already so motivated by this. And like Professor Laguna said, just making noise and being sure to be heard. It's great.
Yeah, and the role, I think the role the arts can play in convincing folks that. Krista, did you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, and I just wanted to say, very quickly, just like you said, Maria, the kids have a lot to say, and they're looking for a lot of support. And I know, especially at the high school level, where they're still trying to either figure out how loud do they want their voice to be. I think as educators, we need to be there to support them and encourage them and be like, the big cheer squad. And the kids are ready and willing to fight for what they want, for what they believe in. But as educators, we also need to be there to help them and support them. So I think that is immensely impactful as well.
Yes, thank you for that. Shall I pass it back to you, Professor Hossein?
If you want to take one more question, we could take one more, I think, and then we'll wrap up.
All right. Well, there was another question that's kind of related to what Krista was sharing there about the role that teachers, can take to make curriculum more comprehensive, inclusive, more just. And what's it like trying to work with administrations, who in some cases may or may not be supportive around making more affirming Latinx, Black, queer curricula?
Yeah, I'll take that. So, in terms of creating curriculum and supporting students, I think it really starts with yourself. Where are you at in terms of your journey and your consciousness? Are you willing to put in the work? Are you willing to learn what you need to learn? And then, I am exceedingly grateful that my district is incredibly supportive of the anti-racist and anti-bias work that we're doing. That is written to the core of our strategic operating plan in our district. But I imagine that not every district is like that. And so yeah, I'm going to go back to what you said, Professor Laguna. Schools don't like bad press. They don't like to see their name in the paper for a bad reason. And what we're doing here is for our students, is for our communities, is for our future. And that's a very strong platform to grow classes out of, to grow curriculum out of, to grow programs out of, and to encourage other people, administration and teachers, to get, on the same page with. So it comes down to, fight the good fight and educate yourself where you need to be educated and connect with people that are willing to learn and grow with you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll pass it back to you, Professor Hossein, for a quick closing.
Yes, a quick. All right, Jose, we're at the end. What do you think? Did we learn some stuff tonight?
I got a lot of notes, so I think I learned a lot.
Yeah. We're just so grateful for all of you. Jose, do you want to just do a quick run of gratitude and then we'll thank everyone else for coming?
Yeah, no, I'm so grateful for everyone's contributions to this panel. Just the way you're all centering student voices and creating this curriculum into thinking about how what we learn in schools can truly make an impact in our futures and the future of this world. And Krista, thank you very much for just putting that very beautifully at the end of this panel. And just thank you all for being in conversation with each other. I really appreciate it.
Yes. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone who worked behind the scenes, all of our co-sponsors, the panelists. Thanks to all of you who listened in, who gave up a part of your Wednesday night. So grateful for all of this. We're gonna just remind you of two events coming up that we promise will be as exciting as this. Wednesday, March 24th, teaching Black and Latinx Studies in Connecticut. And then the following Tuesday, a wonderful event on teaching Indigenous Studies. Thanks to everyone who helped out behind the scenes, our co-sponsors. Jose, thank you so much for leading us through this. Really grateful. And we really hope to see everyone at our next event, okay? Thanks, everybody, and good night.